ahead and get started. So, hi, I'm Joe Fothery from the National Network of State Teachers of the Year. I serve as the Director of Strategic Projects, and really excited about our webinar we have tonight on building career continuums for teachers. With us, we have our presenters, Lynn Gaddis, who was a 1995 Illinois Teacher of the Year. She's also the president of our state chapter for INSTOY here in Illinois. And then Catherine Fisk, Natale, who is an independent education consultant and used to work for the Connecticut State Department of Ed. And then I also have with me tonight INSTOY's new communication director, Lori Calvert, and she's on, and she'll be following the Twitter, or not the Twitter feed, but the chats on the back end of things. So if you have questions, comments, please feel free to chat, and we'll stop along the way for some conversation. We really want this to not only be an informative piece, but also an engaging one. So, Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you guys and look forward to an evening of conversation.
Well, thank you, Joe. We're just wanting to start with this quote where this DC LIFT teacher is kind of sharing with us everything that exemplifies why teacher career advancement initiatives are important. She shows the importance of standards, collegiality, shared accountability, job satisfaction, and motivation, impact on student learning, and just so much more in her passion for teaching kids. Next. If we look at this arrow, the first section shows us that it takes a minimum of 5 years for a teacher to get comfortable or proficient in teaching, and it may take some teachers much longer to get to highly effective. In the second part of the arrow, we look at what Richard Ingersoll at the University of Pennsylvania says, that it's 40 to 50% of our teachers are leaving within the first 5 years before they've even developed their expertise or to be proficient or better. He also notes that the primary reason that they leave is due to their lack of voice or autonomy. And teachers won't stay if there aren't career advancement opportunities. And this is so true with our Gen Y teachers. In the third section, we're seeing that social science is clear. We'll go back one, Joe. And we're looking at the third part of the arrow. No? All right, right there, management, the green one. Social science is clear that management systems based on opportunities for autonomy and mastery and purpose lead to enhanced performance. And Daniel Pink, in his popular book, Drive, summarizes the intrinsic motivation that moves businesses and helps management systems. And so organizations like Google have known this and have organized around it, and it provides those opportunities for autonomy and motivation. In the last one, we look at, well, where are we going with teachers for teacher career advancement continuums? And it's that need for that intrinsic motivation for teachers. And so that is why we wanted to look at this study on the next slide, to be able to look at the 3 questions that we came up with. What does it look like and how do we do it? But the first one looks at what are the design features of an effective career advancement model. And then once we know those features, what are the conditions? The second question, what are the enabling conditions that are needed to launch and sustain those models? And our last question, what are the general principles for developing effective models? So let me turn it over to Katie to talk about the study sites and study methods.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you, Joe. We chose the following 8 sites because they represented a large and diverse range of career advancement models and stages of implementation, from brand new initiatives to those that were actually sunsetting. We wanted to represent different regions of the United States, as well as different types of school systems. So we have in here charters and public schools, urban schools, schools in more rural districts, some with a strong union presence, some with not. And you'll see here, if you can see across this, Aspire Summit Charter Academy is in Modesto, California. We, in contrast, DC Lift is in Washington, DC. We looked at the Denver Differentiated Roles Pilot, Knox County TAP program, which we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Scottsdale, Arizona, their Career Ladder program. Southeast Polk, Iowa, Teacher Leadership and Compensation Initiative. The Seattle Career Ladder program, and what is called the Lift Opportunity Culture Initiative, which is based in Charlotte, Mecklenburg. And I hope that you do take the time to read our report, which talks much more eloquently than we'll be able to do this evening about the uniqueness of each of the sites and how they contributed to what we will be telling you about the conclusions that we reached. Study methods. Very briefly, we don't want to get into a lot of that. Again, you can read it in more detail. But we sent teams of researchers to collect on-site data, which included meeting with the district program coordinator to get their perspective on the program and its implementation. And we held focus groups with representative group of principals engaged in the program, and importantly, teachers who represented the range of grade levels and roles along the career continuum. And Lynn and I can talk a little bit about that because we did some of this ourselves, which was fascinating. We also looked at district policy documents that talked about the program structures and their implementation policies. And whenever possible, we requested copies of external evaluations or available impact data. For example, impact on teacher recruitment, retention, and possibly even student achievement. And all of these data were triangulated to support the observations we made in the report. And Lynn and I were the instrumental researchers who reviewed the transcripts of those interviews. We coded, all of that is in our main report. But again, we used some, I think, robust qualitative data methodology, and you will see throughout our report many, and in this presentation, many verbatim quotations from participants, because in many ways it was the voices of teachers, the voices of principals that really spoke to the important conclusions that we drew. And then we also created research summaries, and as I said, if there was additional data that we could incorporate into this report, we did. There were 7 study sites in which we went out and conducted this research. We also had data from a complementary case study in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina, called the Opportunity Culture Initiative. And this is a project coordinated by an organization known as Public Impact. And we gathered, they did the actual on-site research, but we gathered information from their research, memoranda, interviews, and case studies, and we include them in our report. Now I'm going to turn this over to Lynn to talk about the design features that we learned from our research.
So yes, let's get started on the good stuff, what we learned. Results from this study highlighted these design elements that should be incorporated into any teacher career advancement initiative. And what we're hoping to do is to go through all of this and hope you can hear the voices of the people that then revealed to us what was going to be necessary. So on the next slide, let's look at structured teacher leader roles. And they were integral to the district priorities. Teachers spoke of their options to move in and out of their roles at their own pace. And this Seattle teacher showed how they were detailed in public descriptions of the roles. We were very purposeful when planning our structure in the system. We had clear expectations. When there were public job descriptions with specific eligibility criteria and processes, and it was rigorous, this transparency enabled teachers to trust and open their classrooms to work together. That transparency and clear expectations were very important. On the next slide, we look at another feature for compensation differentiation. And this was for the teachers' leaders' work in these roles. The systems for compensation differed among the sites, but most districts offered a stipend for teachers' extra time before and after school or during the summer. Compensation was appreciated by the teachers, but not always did they feel it was adequate for the time and amount of work they did. This Seattle teacher explained that teachers' leaders' motivation for this work was to be stronger teachers. If you could go back one slide, Joe. This Denver teacher shared how the compensation validated her work. I felt valued because I was getting monetary payments for my excellence. When there's adequate release time, training, and support to perform their leadership roles, additional compensation may be less critical to teacher leaders. Next slide. Another feature was arranging for opportunities for collaboration. An Aspire Summit Charter Academy teacher showed support was ongoing over time. It's not that one snapshot. A Seattle teacher also told us the story of how at first it was hard to get teachers to seek her out as a coach because she had no time built into the schedule. But once they gave her one prep period a day to be a coach, she said passionately, but the minute they knew I had a free period now to do this job, it was like, I can't stop them from coming. Next slide. Release time was key for teachers to be able to collaborate. Teachers no longer waited for the next institute day or rushed into the hall before or after school to help a colleague. Because they knew they had time during the school day, they could engage in deeper conversations about how to improve their practice for their students. This DC Lift teacher explained how that release time improved the coaching. And she said passionately, and so since I'm only teaching half time, I can utilize the other half of my day to do all the other things. Many other teacher leaders at different sites shared how it was like having two full-time jobs and trying to balance their lives. Another design feature found across all sites was peer coaching. Each site defined the role of the peer coach a little differently and supported teacher leaders through training and varied collaboration activities. They were mentors, co-teaching, model teaching, analyzing student work and data, observing, and conferencing with teachers to improve instruction. This Scottsdale teacher explained the value of peer coaching and how both the teacher and the teacher leader learned and improved their own practice. It was a huge window into how I taught. It's just colleagues sharing information in terms of how you can be better. Next slide. This Knox County teacher explained how coaching is key for new teachers through constant support, constant leadership coming in and showing me what to do. And on this next slide, a DC Lift teacher added the impact for experienced teachers, because you are non-judgmental, non-evaluative, non-threatening situation. They trust you. But what we also found in this next slide was that peer evaluation was a new experience for most teachers, and only a few sites combined peer coaching with peer evaluation. There was a tension for teachers who took risks with the peer coach when they were opening up themselves, but they were concerned when they took those risks that it would end up being a weakness or some kind of punishment in their evaluation. The Denver administrator here explained how they had designed to combine these roles by being very intentional about why peer coaching and evaluation live together. They ensured that they had the right support and training in place for both the peer coaching and evaluators. Trust and effectiveness occurred in peer coaches who were responsible for parts of the evaluation with strong leadership who understood this tension, where there was union support, where there was a transparent evaluation system, and where there were well-trained peer evaluators. On the next slide, we find another feature, which was teacher-led, just-in-time, job-embedded professional development opportunities. There's a strong belief at these sites that teachers learn best when the professional development experiences are embedded in the curriculum, instruction, and assessment systems of the district for the immediate needs of both the teachers and the students' learning. A coach in Southeast Polk shared that a reluctant teacher had not been following district guidelines to use a particular reading strategy. After months of the coach building relationships, the teacher finally asked for help. The instructional coach partnered with the teacher and another model teacher so that she could observe a lesson with those particular strategies. Then the coach co-planned with the teacher and reflected. The teacher then taught a lesson where the coach observed, took notes, and also videotaped. And the coach then had a reflection conversation afterwards. You can hear the coach's satisfaction in her words. That was really pushing her comfortably. With all her students, she'll be using that strategy. That's 90 more kids that got exposure that wouldn't have if we did not have this program. Next slide. Another design feature was to build in structured teacher voice for teacher voice in making shared decision making. The leadership teams respected and sought one another's expertise. Teacher leaders were the liaison between the teachers and the principal and among all the teachers. Teachers saw the resultant changes from their own input. You can see by this quote from the Aspire principal how she values the teacher leadership's voices, the teacher leaders' voices. I'm so appreciative of having a team who are talented, dedicated. It's nice to have a team of leaders to go to and work with as a resource. He needed them. But likewise, on this next slide, we see a quote from a teacher from the same school who was echoing the same sentiment that the principal had about the leadership team. I think she has the power of team. She has the benefit of a lead team. Every teacher here has a leadership quality in some aspect or in many aspects. Many principals and teachers throughout the sites expressed how their relationships changed and how they do not know how they could ever go back to isolation. Let me take a little bit of a break here to see if you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share or ask about the design features.
This is a great opportunity because I'm curious, Lynn, you have all these powerful anecdotal stories. It just seems like it's a running theme where everybody keeps talking about, hey, you give me time. Here are the direct benefits that kids are going to receive. This is how it's going to impact faculty. I've seen a couple of things about administrative responses, but do you get much data out there from the administrators? Were they reluctant at first to turn the keys of the car over to the teachers? Did they feel like they were losing power or authority in their buildings? Was there any issues that you find with like jealousy in the building? And you can pick any one of those things. I'm just curious. A lot of those things are coming to mind as thoughts that I might see happening as this is going on.
And Jill, that is an excellent question. In the next section, we'll talk a little bit about that. But the whole idea of that you have to go to shared decision making, and the idea that both the teacher leaders, the administrators, And also the teachers who are part of that culture all had to have training and have understanding about it, and trust had to be built. Those relationships had to change. So when we talk, I'll talk a little bit in the enabling conditions, that there has to be some readiness. So those schools where that shared decision-making was already taking place, this was a natural flow. But for those where you just jump in and, hey, let's all have a new career advancement initiative and let's start it next month, they talked at length about how that culture had to shift and how the going at the beginning, it was intense. But what was kind of exciting across all the sites that had been up and running for a while was that they did not want to ever go back.
Great.
Katie, did you have anything to add to that?
Actually, when we talk about some of the key lessons that we learned, which I'll be talking about, one of them talks about the changes in relationships between teachers and administrators that can be extremely positive, but also present challenges. I think one of, and again, we'll talk about it a little later, and I would love to hear some of input for some of the people here, participants. But when you institute these new teacher career initiative structures, it also results in changes in the role of the principal. We think the evidence points to many positive roles, but yes, change, as it can be difficult for teachers, is difficult for principals too. And there are districts in which principals, opt in or opt out of these leadership initiatives, and often over time we see more of them opting in. But yes, huge changes to the role of principals and other administrators, which, as I said, we'll talk a little bit more later, and would love to get some conversation from you guys about too.
Excellent. And one of the things, please keep in mind that you can always chime in on the chat line. Our Director of Communications, Lori, is following the chat. So if you have questions for our speakers, please let us know. And then I am going to give you one for the parking lot that I'd like you to think about, maybe answer later. But I'm curious about how community sees the role in teacher continuums. Do they see that as teachers are doing their job, or do they understand that this is a new way of teaching, and how does that change environment? But just for something for a parking lot down the road. But I'll turn it back over to you.
Very good question. Okay, we'll get to it.
Okay, on the next slide, will there anyone else with a question?
Lynn, can you hear me?
Yes.
I had sent one on the chat, which was, I just wondered, in terms of the design, what surprised you the most? I mean, some of this, what I'm hearing, I'm thinking, yeah, I probably would have known that. I would have known that. But then something sounded new, and I was just wondering, when you all were going through it, what stood out as either surprised you the most or seems to be one of the big things that people don't get? It's the next thing they've got to get to make this work.
How, I guess the part I'm about to go into.
Okay.
The idea, no, I'll just say
that. That's a segue then.
Was everybody wants to go out and let's design it and let's get all the parts, but they forget about the conditions and what is going to enable that to happen. So all 5 of these next topics we're going to talk about were the big ahas that you better have the conditions in place or it's not going to happen. So we've got, and that's what I worry about, even with the ESSA now coming out, that we're all going to run around trying to do teacher leadership and career advancement initiatives and have teacher voice. So we're just going to pick and stick people, and then that's it. We're done.
And then we're going to say teacher leadership didn't work.
Yeah. So that's,
yeah.
So the conditions have to be there. And that's kind of what Joe was asking too also, that if you're going to have shared leadership, you have to have conditions for that to happen.
Thank you.
So let's just move right into this. Here are the 5 enabling conditions that we discovered from our research, and that we will explain here in just we'll just go one by one. But readiness, stakeholder involvement, school leadership, school culture, and funding sustainability. So let me start with school readiness. On the next slide, the readiness of a district or school is critical because the adoption of a teacher career initiative involves altering traditional relationships between the teachers and the administrators, creating cultures in which teachers willingly open up their classrooms for scrutiny by peers and others, and accepting new working relationships, as well as differentiated roles and compensation for teacher leaders. And this involves building trust. And so whatever is in place already, when we start to move into this, it's very helpful. As you can see by that one quote from the person from Southeast Polk, timing could not have been better. They had all these things going on, and when they decided to move into this initiative, everything just flowed. Now, Joe, in response to a question you had earlier about community, let me say on this next slide that besides being ready, you also have to have stakeholder involvement. So it's involvement of teachers, administrators, teachers associations and unions, parents, school boards, community members, business. They're all critical, not just for launching, not just for designing or implementing, but also for long-term continuous improvement. This administrator shared what they did on their roadshow over time to go to every possible person in groups, including students, to be able to get their input at the beginning stages, but they also talked about to us how they had continued this through the different stages. They even talked about how they went to the school board early before they even started to design, and then they kept it going with the school board with the report outs so that the school board was part of all the stages. So stakeholder involvement and community are very important. Next slide. School culture. To change school culture, teacher and administrators are critical as partners in shared decision-making, solving issues, and improving practice through expertise, their commitment, their enthusiasm. A positive school culture is a prerequisite for any kind of successful career advancement initiative. And I want to say this real strongly. It is a collaborative system and culture, not competition. And after the last few years of some of the issues that teachers have faced in isolation, this is also something that will need to change. As this Denver teacher said passionately about the prospect of a lack of vision among administrators and teachers, a Denver teacher said, "It's going to turn into a hotbed bevy of messing unless we change the culture." And so let me turn this over to Katie to talk about the other two, leadership and funding sustainability.
Thank you, Lynn. I want to talk about two levels of leadership here. One is policy leadership, and the other is district leadership, both of which are really critical. Strong district leadership is a necessary prerequisite for teacher career initiatives to be sustainable or successful. But at the same time, we've also seen in these 8 case studies what I'm terming, or we've termed, policy leadership, in which such career initiatives were encouraged by, for example, the federal government through the Teacher Incentive Fund grant program, through organizations like NIET, National, see if I can remember this acronym right now, but they're the fostering the TAP program, states, the Iowa Teacher Leadership and Compensation Grant Program was initiated at the state level, Southeast Polk being one of their first districts to get the grant, and organizations like Public Impact. So we see in this instance policy leadership to get districts interested, and then the importance of strong district leadership to actually embrace initiatives. One of the concerns we saw articulated to us is concerns over transitions in district level leadership, particularly in large urban districts, are a cause for concern because they worry that politics can impact on leadership continuity and the initiatives launched by those former leaders. But I think this quotation is really critical to understanding leadership where it really counts, and that is the importance of teachers. Teachers being involved in designing, implementing, providing feedback. So we really learned that leadership occurs at all levels, regardless of any formal roles that people have as leaders. And I do think, given the fact that our teachers spoke so eloquently about their roles, that this quote by a Denver teacher is really critical. The next thing I want to talk about is another critical enabling condition, and that is financial sustainability. As mentioned, in terms of policy leadership, well, there was money that came with some of this policy leadership, and we've seen in all of these sites, state, federal, or private foundation grant funding being often invaluable to kickstart these teacher advancement initiatives. But, big question, planning upfront how to continue the initiatives after the grants phase out is critical for the credibility of the program and the buy-in of teachers, staff, who are often very skeptical when they've seen grant-funded programs come and go. And I'll go back and remember Lynn's comments about stakeholder support. This is really where stakeholder support is critical. You need to build that from day one, because when the day comes when you have to start planning for how you sustain this initiative after the initial grant funding dries up, then you need the investment of the community, the school board, and others to help support the initiative. The other thing we learned is that it is possible to redirect existing funds related to staffing or professional development to new purposes, which can be useful in transitioning from grant funds to existing budgets. And I think we'll talk about this later, but we saw in districts such as Denver a real rethinking of the structures of leadership within schools that in many ways it's diminishing the number of pure administrative positions and replacing them with teacher leaders and teacher leadership positions. Does anybody want to comment on what Lynn and I have talked about, those enabling conditions, before we move on to our key findings of the report? Any questions or comments?
I see a question from Lisa.
Yeah.
It says, you want to read it, Lisa?
Sure. Okay, so having a supportive principal is essential, right? It's wonderful. It empowers you. It's just fantastic. However, how do you justify the comp time that you need to get this job done via the superintendent, the board? You're missing time from class. And then where do you start with the stakeholders and going to the board to support for this teacher leadership? And then the second question is, do you have advice for that? You mentioned the building of trust and validation. So what is it? Do you invite them into the group, and does that impact teacher leadership? And if it's new teachers, do they feel comfortable? And I guess, how do you prove that what we're doing is worthy?
Great question. Thank you. I would say that on your first question about justifying comp time, that was addressed at all of the sites. In some districts, like in Iowa, Southeast Polk, they hired full-time teacher instructional coaches, and then also had model teachers who were given some comp time and also some pay for the summers. For them to be model teachers for people to come in and see their classrooms. In other places, as we said, Seattle and in Denver at the high school levels, they were given maybe one free period, one period when they were teaching for release time. There were all kinds of different compositions of the release time. I would say that in all of them, they talked at length about the idea of not taking a teacher out of a classroom for years at a time because they would lose that closeness to the students. So in many of them, they were looking at hybrid roles and ways to get that comp time to allow teachers not to have what I had said earlier, the 2 full-time jobs of coaching and teaching.
Lynn, could I add one comment? One of the administrators at Southeast Polk, I think, expressed it really importantly, and I think was mirrored in another Summit Charter Academy, if I'm recalling correctly. But basically saying, you know, we're not just taking Mrs. X, who's a wonderful teacher, out of the classroom and taking her away from her students. Rather, we're taking Mrs. X and having her work with, you know, many teachers so that all of those teachers will be more effective. So the rationale is by placing teachers in leadership roles, working with their peers, especially when these are you're designed to be your excellent teachers, you're spreading that expertise over more teachers and more students. And that being the rationale as to why it's okay to take a really outstanding teacher out of some direct teaching responsibilities, because that teacher is going to take that expertise and build it among his or her peers.
Now, when you ask the second question about trust and validation, that becomes extremely contextual. And so the idea is that the more transparent the initiative is as it's being designed and developed, then the better it is for building that trust and validation. So we heard from many where they had to quickly implement because that is when the grant started, and they didn't know for sure what their job descriptions were, nor did the teachers in the building. So there was all this mistrust and wondering what's going on. In other places where there were very transparent, very public job descriptions with eligibility criteria and a process for selecting, many teachers opted out of wanting to be the leader because it was not something that looked appealing to them. And they also knew then what the role of the teacher leader was to be. And so it wasn't accidental or organic. It was very well thought out. And so that helped to build a little bit of the trust. But it's still the idea that if you're contextually in a school where teachers are isolated and the evaluations are very risky, then the teacher does not want to come out of their classroom and open up to mentors or to teacher leaders. And there's a mistrust there. And so it's building that culture over time, and it may take time for that to build. Then I would say that's very key, transparency and time. And also the selection of the right mentors.
The last question was about, we have a problem here with a phone call coming in. How do we prove this is worthwhile? I think we will answer some of that question in our next session, which is some of the key findings and lessons that we learned from this study.
Okay.
So, okay to launch into that, or any other questions?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Apologies for the phone ringing in the background.
No.
Hang on. Okay. Well, we'll just hopefully keep moving. Okay. These 8 case studies highlighted that we think we have a very powerful existence proof that teacher career advancement initiatives are feasible in both the short and the long term, in diverse schools and districts across the country, and in districts with and without a strong union presence. And I think we'll also be telling you, to answer that last question, these initiatives can provide significant benefits to teachers, administrators, students in the school district in which they serve. So the next slide is going to give you, just quickly, and I'm going to go through one by one, 7 general observations. And you can take a quick look at them here, but then we're just going to go into the slides the succeeding slides and talk about them. But we are going to, very importantly, let some of the voices of teachers and administrators speak to the benefits and challenges they face in implementing these career initiatives. So let's begin with the first slide about positive trends in the recruitment and retention of teachers. All of the districts with teacher career advancement initiatives reported an increase in applicants to teach in the district and increased teacher retention rates. These case studies very vividly illustrated that teacher leadership opportunities have a positive impact on the retention of effective, experienced teachers. Now, we also saw in some instances that there was some attrition among experienced teachers for whom the idea of opening up their classrooms for coaching or evaluation by their peers was considered threatening. And we can go back and talk a little bit about school culture and how, that can mitigate against that. And in some ways, the loss of these teachers was considered not necessarily a bad outcome, because sometimes these were not the highly performing teachers. But in general, very positive impact. And again, this quotation from an Aspire Summit Charter Academy teacher is this notion of working with a team, being part of a team, is being a very powerful incentive to continue working in the district. The next conclusion we obviously, and it sounds fairly obvious, I'm sure, for many people here, is creating time for teachers to meet and collaborate is essential, and it's a challenge. And we see from this quotation a Knox County teacher leader saying sometimes it can be overload. There is a real challenge here. We saw expressed about the concerns over burnout of highly talented teacher leaders, or the discouragement of otherwise very qualified teachers from taking on leadership roles. And again, stipends are wonderful, and additional pay is definitely valued. But I think, as all those who have worked in schools know, time is a valuable commodity for teachers to really fulfill their leadership roles. And releasing teachers, on the other hand, full-time for instructional coaching and replacing those teachers in the classroom is extremely expensive, which is one of the reasons we saw in several districts the concept of hybrid teaching roles, in which teachers spend part of their time directly working with students and part of their time providing coaching to their peers. Another conclusion. Again, I think you're not surprised, there's more collegial interaction and shared responsibility for one's colleagues. And I really like these couple of quotations, because you really talked again about this notion of shared responsibility. You can't let down the people you're working with, and there's more sharing and so forth. Again, the notion of working with your colleagues and working with your colleagues across grade levels and subject areas was perceived as very valuable. But as we have alluded to, it takes time and effort to change the culture of isolation and promote sharing of collaboration. Again, the most positive benefit of this collegial interaction is teachers feeling responsible for the success of their colleagues in improving student learning. And that's a big, I think, conclusion we saw across our study sites. Our fourth major lesson was, and this is back to answering the question of how do we prove this is all worthwhile, is we saw evidence of positive impact on teacher effectiveness and short-term learning outcomes. And again, we have one quotation from a director of the Opportunity Culture Initiative, Charlotte Mecklenburg. There was not as much hard data as we would have liked in these case studies about the impact of teacher career advancement on student achievement, but there was tons of anecdotal evidence from teachers, administrator focus groups. Some of these programs that we have been in effect for only a relatively short period of time and are often accompanied by other district reform initiatives. So to parse out what is exactly due to the teacher leadership initiative can be rather tricky. Nonetheless, we saw site after site, teachers and administrators talking about the benefits of collaboration, focused conversations on curriculum and instruction, lesson modeling, and reflection on teacher effectiveness. In fact, one DC teacher said, "I have to play my A game every day." A fifth lesson we learned was increased job satisfaction by teachers. And again, we saw consistently that teachers taking on leadership roles without stepping into formal administrative roles see that as a very significant positive feature of teacher career advancement initiative. And again, I think these two quotations really sum it up for teachers who don't want to be removed from instruction or kids, but want to have a definite impact on and voice in their schools, their school culture, their school policies. The general consensus of teacher leaders interviewed was that motivation and job satisfaction were positively affected by opportunities for collaboration and professional development, and obviously recognition for their work. Sixth conclusion, and I think this goes back to a question earlier about changes in teacher-administrator relationships and how principal roles change, but also the challenges presented. I like this one about the we. It's not us and them, it's we, which is a very, I think, one instance of evidence that teacher career advancement initiatives benefit principals by creating shared leadership structures in schools and giving teachers more choice in decision making. We heard from some principals talking about the difference between feeling very isolated in terms of what they had to do and then now having a team of teachers that they could work with. So we see that relations between teachers and administrators often became much more collaborative. However, it really also changed the role of administrators from needing skills in dealing with teams of teachers, and this is something that generally they're not prepared to do, and that was one of the challenges that is, we identified in this report. Number 7, well, it's not always easy sustaining these teacher career path initiatives. And again, that's where money kind of comes in. I love this one. They get you hooked on it and throw you a lot of money. And most of these initiatives started off with some grant funds and we did see evidence that there are districts who were able to think about that. But it's more than that, because what's really required, as we've said before, in order to launch a teacher career path initiative, it requires a vision, stakeholder support, and a school district culture that can deal with change and ambiguity, and external support, money and technical assistance in many instances. Again, sustaining it has the same challenges, except the money issue often comes into the forefront, with many teachers and administrators expressing skepticism in the long term. So the good news is that some of our study sites are navigating this treacherous territory with some success. Seattle, as an example, has been able to move what was originally teacher incentive fund grant funding into their baseline school funding through their teacher contracts. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools Opportunity Culture Initiative, that sounds like a big mouthful, but if you read the report, you'll understand a little better. But that offers an alternative to the traditional ways in which teacher leadership roles are funded and how they can be maintained sustainably over time. And that is really about creating very different teacher roles, as they say, extending the reach of effective teachers through judicious use of technology, use of paraprofessionals, but in essence, similar to Denver, of flattening an organization, the organizational structure of schools, and replacing some highly paid administrators with teacher leaders. So we're seeing some examples of districts doing really kind of cool, innovative things. So there are, sort of in summary of some of this, we think there are new opportunities emerging for opportunities to build effective career continuums. ESSA authorization allows states and districts to invest in teacher career advancement initiatives, and we hope that what we've learned here is helpful. But I also want to talk a little bit something really critical here, which when we get into, sort of the big overarching lesson, Lynn, you can comment on that. But that is one of the important things we learned is the need to transform conceptions of teacher leadership as an individual calling, teacher on their own being a leader in their district, to a systemic restructuring of the teaching profession. So kind of with that, turn it over to Lynn and any questions you have to sort of open this up to more discussion.
Yeah, so that's just the very small charge that we have on how we move from the individual teacher leader who feels like we have to go and knock on doors and say, please, may I be a leader, to how do we create systemic change to where informal and formal roles are just a natural part of a teacher's career advancement through a lattice rather than a ladder, as to how teachers move in and out of leadership roles through the context of what they're doing at that moment and in the unique schools and districts. And that was another, Lori asked me earlier, what was the big learning? The big learning is also that one size doesn't fit all, and that it's very contextual. So I do see a couple questions here, and I'd like to address a couple. Let me just get one here. Kathy asked about hybrid roles, and are we seeing them across all grade levels? You seem to hear it more easily implemented in a high school rather than in elementary. What I would say is that we saw them in all, at all levels, at all grade levels. Yes, high school is easier because you're on these nice little these schedules during the day, but people were very creative in how they hired adults to be in the school and what their roles were. And I believe it was in the Aspire Academy where we remember people talking about that there were so many different teacher roles that their kids were so used to teachers coming in and out of the rooms, adults in and out of the rooms, that if a teacher had to leave for a training or to go to a meeting, the kids didn't even know anything was happening because that had happened because it was such a collaborative group and there were so many different ways for them to work. There were model teachers and there were master teachers and paraprofessionals, and everybody was moving in and out. So that's one way, and you have to be a little more creative, but that is why Polk, we talked earlier why they went to, we're going to pull them out full time. We think it would have more of an impact. There's another couple questions here about TIF grants. The teacher incentive funds, these come from the states through to the schools. And someone asked a question about how do you get this grant money? Well, what a great question. Because
do you want me to take a stab at that, Lynn?
Well, let me say one. With the reauthorization of ESSA now, the state money is coming through. Title II grants will be coming through schools or through the states to the districts. And it will be very important because there are parts of that with guidelines that there should be teacher voice, teacher leadership, mentoring, professional development that is teacher-led. All of that wording is in that. And so it will be really key for teacher leaders to be part of that. And I'll go ahead and turn it back to you, Katie, to answer that.
No, I just wanted to say the Teacher Incentive Fund grants originated, longer than 8 or 10 years ago. And basically they were designed to look at alternative performance-based compensation as well as differentiated roles for teachers. So if you go on the federal education website, you can see that there were tons of them launched, many of them in major cities, but some of them to organizations that supported, for example, the TAP program and so forth. And ESSA, as Lynn has pointed out, continues these. These can be, states can apply for them. Many times it's a district or an organization can. So there's many different ways that, consortia can be applied. And again, states often have an impact on how their districts can apply for those grants. So that's it.
And we've got time for about one more question. Our hour is drawing up to an end. So does anyone else have a question about tonight's conversation? Or Lynn or Katie, if there was one thing you could go back and do differently that you wish you had known this information prior to doing the research, is there something you would do differently today, or would you have attacked the assignment the same way?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think the way we pursued this research was very effective because, frankly, we learned some things we had no idea about when we launched this. What I would love to see is the ability to go out and there were other school districts that had teacher career initiatives. And again, I think there's one thing we want to point out. Most of these had features of teacher career advancement initiatives. I'm not sure any of them approached an ideal model, and that potentially is the subject of the next phase of this research, which is putting together what we learned from these case studies, and we'd love to do a few more if we had the time or the money, but also to think about how you really articulate a full-scale model that allows teachers to opt in and opt out of teacher leadership positions. I mean, looking at the research on what, Gen X teachers or Gen Y teachers or whatever we want to call them want, which is more flexibility, ability to ramp up and ramp down careers, as we're seeing a little bit more in the corporate sector. So if anything, I just like to see this type of research continue because I think we uncovered some good things, and I think there's more out there than we were able to find. Lynn, what are your thoughts? Well,
and before Lynn hops on, I'll let you close with this, Lynn, before I wrap up, that's one of the things that I think we're discovering right now is the fact that teachers, administrators, and policymakers are all looking for models. We had some great questions tonight, and while there's a real strong interest in this, a lot of people want to see what this looks like, and they want to hold it in their hands, and they want somebody else to test drive it. They don't want to be the guinea pig. And so I'm really excited about research going forward. But I also like those anecdotal stories and the power behind it, so it puts faces with the numbers. And I think that's really important that we realize that while all of this is taking place, these are real people, and it's changing real lives for either good or bad. And so there's a lot at stake here, and we want to make sure and knock it out of the park the right way. So, Lynn, a minute for you to wrap things up.
Well, I thank you for saying that, Joe, because one of the things that I'm excited about this study is that it was the voices of the people that revealed to us what we discovered. And I can't say that enough. So for you to have seen that in our presentation makes me feel really good about it because I want to honor their voices. But what I'm most excited about now is how we take what we've learned, because everybody wants to know what does it look like and how do we do it. Well, I think this study gives us some organizers to the features and the conditions that need to be in place and the learnings that Katie was talking about at the end, that if we start to use those as guidance, then as we're developing this, we'll be able to put some things together. What I'm hoping we can do, what we're trying to do now is interview some people in other places to start to put little stories together and vignettes of what those features look like. But I also look forward to sharing this with lots of people and having people read it and be able to take those features, enabling conditions, and the lessons we've learned to start to put some things together.
Excellent. Well, and as a guest at the International Summit of 2015, I can tell you teacher leadership was the #1 point of conversation by all delegates by far. And it is sweeping around the world. And so we appreciate the work that you have done, and we'd encourage all of our guests on tonight to share the report. If you need more information on it, you can reach out to me at Joe, @nnstoy.org. That's JOE@nnstoy.org. I'll be happy to help connect you in any way that I can. Once again, we'd like to thank NSTOY for sponsoring this webinar tonight, and look forward to seeing you on our next one. So thanks again for everybody being on tonight, and appreciate for all you do to help elevate the profession.
Hey, Joe, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Is the PowerPoint going to be available